Most people look at a man like Li Kang and see a coffin. They see the end of a road they never wanted to walk down. But me, I looked at him and saw a doorway. I didn't need a hero to pull me out of the fire. I needed the fire itself to stand still long enough for me to use its light. I sat across from him on that empty blue line train, my backpack heavy with everything I had left in this world, and I didn't ask him for $1. I didn't ask him for a home. I looked him dead in those eyes that had seen the life go out of 1,000 men, and I said, I need you to be the lie that keeps me alive. I need you to be my father, and in exchange, I'll give you the only thing you don't have, a soul that isn't for sale. The city of Chicago doesn't sleep. It just holds its breath. And in the silence of 3 a.m, the predators and the prey usually know their places. Li Kang was the king of the predators, a man who had the city in his palm, yet lived in a penthouse that felt like a high-altitude tomb. Then there was Winnie, 10 years old Afro-Korean, with a mind that moved like a chess master and a heart that had been forced to turn to stone far too early. Her mother was gone. The lawyers were circling like vultures, and the foster system was a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She didn't want a daddy, she wanted a partner. This isn't a story about a girl being rescued. It's a story about 2 people who realize that being alone is a choice, and being together, well, that's a strategy that just might change the world. Sit tight, hit the subscribe button, and stay tuned as we dig deep into the story. More especially, drop your city in the comments. Now, let's go deep into the genesis of the story. The train car smelled like damp wool and ozone, a sharp, metallic scent that always reminded Winnie of the hospital hallways she'd spent the last month in. She adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of her mother's old film camera against her ribs. It was her anchor. Across from her sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very shadows filling the corners of the subway. Li Kang didn't look like a mob boss. He didn't wear flashy gold or loud suits. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than a year of rent in Winnie's old neighborhood. His hands were folded over a cane topped with a simple silver bird. And his eyes, they weren't mean. They were just empty, like a house where the power had been cut off years ago. You've been following me for 3 stops. Lee's voice was a low rasp, like tires on gravel. He didn't even look up at her. That's a dangerous habit for a child, especially at this hour. Winnie didn't flinch. She'd seen worse things than a man in a suit. She'd seen the light go out of her mother's eyes while a nurse checked a watch. Dangerous is a relative term, Mr. Kang, she said, her voice steady. I think it's more dangerous that your security detail didn't notice me get on at 47th Street. They're 2 cars back, playing on their phones. That made him look up, a slow, deliberate movement of the head. He studied her, really studied her. He saw the dark curls of her hair, the bronze of her skin, and the unmistakable Korean shape of her eyes that mirrored his own in their lack of fear. You know my name, Lee remarked, his interest piqued despite himself. And you know my men. Who are you? My name is Winnie, she said, moving to the seat directly across from him. The train lurched, but she stayed upright. And I'm here because I have a problem that only a man with your specific lack of a conscience can solve. Lee almost smiled. It was a ghost of a gesture. A 10-year-old girl talking about conscience. Go home, Winnie. Whatever you're looking for, I don't give to charity. I'm not asking for charity, Winnie snapped, her eyes flashing. I'm asking for a business arrangement. My mother is dead. She left me an estate, a gallery, a house, and a legacy, but I'm a minor. The state wants to put me in a group home while they manage my assets, which is just a fancy way of saying they're going to steal everything she worked for. I need a legal guardian, someone whose name carries enough weight to shut the courts up. Someone who doesn't want to love me, but just wants a clean image for the press. Li Kang leaned back. The train roared through a tunnel, light and shadow dancing across his face. He was currently under fire from the feds. They were painting him as a cold-blooded monster. A family man image would be a godsend for his legal defense. It would humanize the machine. You're asking me to play a role, Lee said softly. I'm asking you to be the wall I stand behind, Winnie corrected him. "In exchange, I play the perfect daughter. I give you the legitimacy your lawyers say you're missing. We don't have to be friends. We just have to be a team." Li Kang looked at the small girl. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was negotiating. For the first time in a decade, Li felt a spark of something other than boredom. "And if I say no?" Winnie looked out the window at the passing darkness. "Then the city wins. And it's been winning for a long time, hasn't it, Mr. Kang?" The train pulled into the station. Lee stood up, his cane tapping once against the floor. He looked down at her. "Tomorrow morning, 8:00 a.m., my office. Don't be late, Winnie." He turned and walked out into the rain, leaving Winnie alone in the car. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped her camera tight. The contract was signed in the silence, and there was no turning back. The Kang Tower was a monolith of glass that seemed to pierce the very heart of the Chicago sky. It was cold, efficient, and smelled like expensive air. When Winnie walked through the lobby, she felt the stares. A small black girl in scuffed sneakers and a faded hoodie didn't belong in a place that looked like it was built for gods and accountants. She was escorted to the top floor by a man named Nam. He was one of the guards she'd called out on the train. He didn't look at his phone this time. He looked at her like she was a ticking bomb. "The boss is expecting you," Nam said, opening the heavy oak doors. Li Kang wasn't behind a desk. He was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he owned. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Sit down, Winnie." She sat. The leather chair was too big for her, her feet dangling inches from the floor. She hated feeling small, so she sat as tall as she could. "I had my people look into you," Lee said, finally turning. He held a file. "Your mother was a brilliant photographer. She was also complicated. You've lived in 3 different states. You speak 3 languages. And your grades are high enough to get you into any prep school in the country. Why me? Why not a relative?" "Because relatives have expectations," Winnie said, her voice echoing in the vast room. "They'd want me to be a child. They'd want to tell me how to grieve. You don't care how I feel. You just care if I show up on time. I like that." Lee set the file down. "There are rules. If we do this, you are under my protection, but you are also under my thumb. You go where I tell you. You say what I tell you. In public, you are the light of my life, the daughter of a long-lost flame. In private, you stay out of my way." "Deal," Winnie said immediately. "It's not a deal yet." Lee's voice dropped an octave. "If you betray the secrets of this house, if you ever use my name to do something I didn't authorize, the protection ends, and the city is a very cold place for a little girl. Do you understand?" Winnie stood up. She walked over to the window, standing a few feet away from the man who was now, legally, her world. "I've been cold my whole life, Mr. Kang. You're just the first person who's been honest about the temperature." Lee looked down at her. For a fleeting second, he saw something in her expression that reminded him of a mirror. A reflection of a boy who had to grow up in the back alleys of Seoul with nothing but his wits and a blade. "Nam," Lee barked. The guard appeared instantly. "Get her a room, get her a wardrobe, nothing flashy, just quality, and get the lawyers on the phone. I'm filing for immediate temporary guardianship. Tell them I've decided it's time to prioritize my family." As Winnie was led away, she didn't look back. She didn't feel relief. She felt the weight of the new armor she'd just put on. She was no longer a ward of the state. She was a Kang, and she knew that in this city. That name was both a shield and a target. The gala was a sea of silk, champagne, and whispers. The elite of Chicago were gathered to celebrate the opening of a new wing at the Art Institute, a wing Li Kang had donated as part of his image-cleaning initiative. Winnie stood in front of a mirror in her new room. She wore a simple black velvet dress with a white lace collar. It felt like a costume. She touched the small gold locket around her neck, the only thing Lee had given her that felt fatherly, even if it was just for the cameras. "You look like a porcelain doll," a voice said from the doorway. It was Lee. He was in a tuxedo, looking more like a king than a businessman. He looked at Winnie, and for a second his gaze softened. Just a fraction. "Don't get used to it," Winnie whispered. "I'm still the girl from the train." "Good," Lee said, walking toward her. "The girl from the train knows how to survive. The doll just gets broken. Remember, tonight is a performance. There will be people who hate me. They will try to be nice to you to get to me. They will ask about your mother. They will ask where you've been." "I know the script," Winnie interrupted. "I'm the daughter of your one true regret, the girl you found after it was almost too late. I'm the reason you're changing your ways." Lee nodded. "You're smart, maybe too smart." When they arrived at the gala, the cameras were a physical force. The flashes felt like lightning. Lee stepped out of the car first, then reached back. He held his hand out to Winnie. She hesitated. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment. If she took his hand, she was part of his world. She was part of the blood and the shadows. She took it. His hand was large, warm, and steady as a rock. As they walked up the red carpet, the reporters swarmed. "Mr. Kang, who is the girl? Is it true she's your daughter? Lee, look this way." Lee didn't stop. He didn't answer. He just kept his hand firmly on Winnie's shoulder, guiding her through the chaos. They reached the top of the stairs, and a man in a white suit, a rival named Morty, blocked their path. "Lee, I didn't know you." Taken up. "Babysitting." Morty sneered, his eyes sliding over Winnie with a look that made her skin crawl. Lee's grip on Winnie's shoulder tightened, not in fear, but in a warning. "She isn't a guest, Morty. She's a Kang. You should learn the difference before you speak to her again." The air between the two men turned freezing. Winnie felt the tension. She saw the way Lee's men moved in the periphery, hands shifting under their jackets. This wasn't a party. It was a battlefield. Winnie stepped forward, just an inch. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Morty," she said, her voice sweet but her eyes cold as ice. "I've heard so much about your struggling, shipping business. My father says you're a man who really knows how to sink." The silence that followed was deafening. Lee Kang actually let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Morty turned purple, but he couldn't do anything. Not here, not in front of the cameras. As they walked away, Lee leaned down, his voice a whisper near Winnie's ear. "That wasn't in the script." "No," Winnie whispered back, a small, genuine smirk tugging at her lips. "That was a bonus." In that moment, under the glittering lights of the museum, the arrangement shifted. They weren't just pretending anymore. They were starting to enjoy the game. The penthouse felt different after the gala. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the things they hadn't said. Lee Kang sat in his study, the city lights reflecting off the dark wood of his desk like distant, dying stars. He was looking at a digital map of the docks, but his mind kept drifting back to the way Winnie had dismantled Morty with a single sentence. She was a weapon. He'd realized that now. But she was a weapon he hadn't forged, and that made her unpredictable. A soft knock came at the door. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of Nam or his guards. It was light, hesitant. "Enter," Lee said, not looking up. Winnie walked in, still wearing her oversized hoodie, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. She looked smaller in the vastness of the study, but her presence seemed to fill the room. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers over the spines of the leather-bound books. "You have a lot of books about war," she observed. "Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, the Prince. Do you actually read them, or are they just for show?" Lee leaned back, crossing his arms. "In my world, Winnie, there is no difference between what is real and what is for show. If people think you are a scholar of war, they treat you like a general. If they think you are a monster, they stay out of the dark." "And what do you want them to think I am?" she asked, finally turning to face him. "I want them to think you are off limits," Lee said firmly. "But you took a risk tonight. You insulted a man who would kill a priest for a nickel. Why?" Winnie walked to the desk, placing her camera on the edge. "Because he looked at you like you were old, like you were losing your grip. And if you lose your grip, the contract of presence is worthless. I wasn't defending you, Mr. Kang. I was defending my investment." Lee stared at her for a long time. Most people lied to him. They flattered him or they trembled. This child spoke to him like a partner. It was unsettling and strangely refreshing. "I see," Lee murmured. "Then as partners, we should discuss the next phase. The feds are moving faster than I anticipated. They're looking into the charitable foundation I set up in your mother's name. They want to see if it's a shell for money laundering. Tomorrow, a social worker is coming to interview us. Her name is Mrs. Gable. She's been doing this for 30 years. She can smell a lie before you even open your mouth." Winnie nodded, her expression becoming professional. "Then we don't lie. We just change the context. If she asks why I'm here, I'll tell her the truth. That I'm here because nobody else in this city was strong enough to keep me." "And if she asks about our relationship?" Lee asked, his voice softening just a fraction. Winnie looked at the floor. "I'll tell her you're like the weather, unpredictable, cold, and impossible to ignore. But at least when it's raining, you know where you stand." She turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Mr. Kang." "Yes." "My mother always said, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream. They're the ones who whisper while everyone else is shouting. You whisper very well." She disappeared into the hallway, leaving Lee alone with his shadows. He looked down at the camera she'd left on his desk. He picked it up. It was old, a Leica from the 80s. He looked through the viewfinder and saw the city distorted, framed, and suddenly very fragile. Mrs. Gable was a woman made of gray wool and sharp spectacles. She sat in the living room of the penthouse, looking at the minimalist furniture and the expensive art like she was inspecting a crime scene. Winnie sat on the sofa next to Lee. For the first time, they were touching, not because they wanted to, but because the script demanded it. Lee's arm was draped over the back of the sofa, his fingers occasionally brushing Winnie's shoulder. To anyone watching, it looked like a protective, paternal gesture. To Winnie, it felt like being leaned on by a mountain. "Mr. Kang," Mrs. Gable began, her pen hovering over a clipboard, "your history is colorful, to say the least. You've spent the better part of your life avoiding the spotlight. And now, suddenly, you're the guardian of a 10-year-old girl with a very significant inheritance. You can see why the state is concerned." Lee didn't blink. "The state is concerned with numbers, Mrs. Gable. I am concerned with legacy." Winnie's mother was, someone I respected. In our world, respect is a debt that must be paid. I am simply paying it. "And you, Winnie," Mrs. Gable turned her sharp gaze to the girl, "how do you feel about this arrangement? You've lost so much in such a short time. Do you feel safe here?" Winnie looked at Lee, then back at the social worker. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, adding a touch of childlike hesitation that she knew would play well. "Safe," Winnie whispered. "I don't think anyone is ever really safe, Mrs. Gable. My mom was safe in her studio, and then she wasn't. But here. I feel solid." She looked at Lee again, and this time there was a real glimmer of something in her eyes. "He doesn't treat me like I'm broken. Everyone else looks at me and sees an orphan. He looks at me and sees a Kang. I'd rather be a Kang than a victim." Mrs. Gable's expression softened, just a tiny bit. She scribbled something on her paper. "It's a very modern approach to family, but I see the connection." Just then, Lee's phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a private line, one that only rang for emergencies. He ignored it, but Winnie saw his jaw tighten. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Gable asked. Business never stops, Lee said smoothly, standing up. But my daughter's welfare comes first, if you have everything you need. As soon as Mrs. Gable was escorted out by Nam, the mask fell away. Lee grabbed the phone. Speak. Winnie stood by the window, watching the city. She could hear the muffled, angry tone of the person on the other end. She didn't need to hear the words to know that the piece was over. Lee hung up. He looked at Winnie, and for the first time he looked tired. Morty moved on the North Side warehouse, Lee said, his voice cold. He didn't just steal the shipment. He burned it. He's trying to force a war because he thinks I'm distracted by you. Winnie didn't flinch. Are you? Lee walked over to her. He looked down at her, his silhouette blocking out the sun. No, I'm not distracted. I'm focused. Morty thinks he found a weakness. He doesn't realize he just gave me a reason to stop holding back. He reached out, and for the first time without a camera watching, he patted her head. A clumsy, awkward movement of a man who didn't know how to be gentle. Stay inside today, Winnie. The city is going to get very loud, very soon. The war wasn't fought with guns in the street, not yet. It was fought in bank accounts, in intercepted shipments, and in the quiet disappearance of key associates. Lee Kang was a ghost, rarely seen, working from the shadows of his study while the city trembled around him. Winnie found herself a prisoner in a golden cage. She spent her days wandering the penthouse, taking photos of the shadows. She took pictures of the way the light hit the dust motes, the way the ice melted in Lee's forgotten glass of scotch, the way the guards stood like statues outside her door. She was beginning to realize that Lee Kang's power wasn't a gift. It was a burden. He didn't own the city owned him. One night, the power in the building flickered and died. The backup generators kicked in, bathing the penthouse in a dim, eerie red emergency light. Winnie made her way to the study. She found Lee sitting in the dark, his cane across his lap. He wasn't working. He was just waiting. They cut the main line, Lee said into the darkness. Morty is getting desperate. He's coming tonight. Winnie sat on the floor near his feet. She didn't feel afraid. What do we do? Lee looked down at her in the red light. There is no we in this, Winnie. I have a car waiting in the basement. Nam will take you to a safe house in Michigan. The guardianship papers are in your bag. If I don't make it, the lawyers have instructions to ensure your assets are protected. Winnie felt a sharp, cold pang in her chest. It wasn't the plan. They were supposed to be a team. No, she said, her voice small but fierce. Winnie, this isn't a game. I know it's not. She stood up, her eyes bright with a sudden, hot anger. You told me I was a Kang. You told me we were a pack. You can't just send me away because it's getting hard. That's what everyone else does. They leave. They die or they leave. Lee stood up, his height towering over her. I am trying to keep you alive. I've been alive, she shouted back, her voice echoing off the glass. I want to be part of something. I don't want your money, Lee. I don't want the gallery. I want to know that for once in my life. When things get bad, someone stays. The silence that followed was heavy. Lee Kang looked at the girl, this small, fierce girl who was more like him than anyone he had ever known. He saw the loneliness in her that mirrored his own, a loneliness that no amount of power or money could ever fill. Outside, the sound of tires screeching and glass breaking echoed from the street below. Morty was here. Lee looked at the door, then back at Winnie. He reached out and gripped her hand. His palm was rough, scarred, and solid. You want to stay? He asked, his voice a low growl. Yes, she whispered. Then pick up your camera, Winnie, Lee said, his eyes finally catching the light. If we're going to do this, we're going to show this city exactly what happens when you try to break a Kang. He didn't send her to the basement. He walked to the door, pulled a heavy, matte black pistol from his desk, and stood between Winnie and the world. The contract of presence was over. The choice, The real, terrifying choice to be a father had finally begun. The elevator didn't just stop, it groaned. A mechanical scream that echoed through the vents as Morty's men cut the cables to the secondary lift. The penthouse was a fortress, but even a fortress can become a tomb if you don't know the exits. Lee Kang didn't move like a man in a panic. He moved like a clock, precise, ticking down the seconds until the inevitable. He stood in the center of the foyer, his charcoal overcoat open, his hand steady on the silver-topped cane, but his other hand, the one holding the cold steel of his weapon, stayed low, hidden from Winnie's direct line of sight. "Nom, report," Lee said into his earpiece. Silence, then a burst of static. "They're in the stairwell, boss. Sector 4 is compromised. I'm pinned." Winnie was standing by the mahogany sideboard, her Leica camera gripped so tight her knuckles were the color of salt. She wasn't hiding under a table. She wasn't crying. She was watching the monitors. The grainy, red-tinted security feeds that showed shadows moving like sharks through the lower halls. "They're using the service vents," Winnie whispered. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. "Lee, look at camera 6. They aren't coming through the front doors. They're bypassing the security sensors by using the HVAC shafts." Lee looked at the screen. A small, 10-year-old girl had just spotted the tactical flaw his veteran guards had missed. He felt a surge of something, not pride, not yet, but a grim recognition. She saw the world in patterns, just like he did. "If they get into the vents, they can drop gas," Lee muttered. He looked at Winnie. "Can you get to the override? The control room is in the kitchen pantry. It's a small crawl space. I'm too large to fit. And Nom is trapped." Winnie didn't hesitate. She didn't ask if it was safe. She knew it wasn't. "What do I do?" "Go to the panel. Cut the oxygen flow to the central shaft. It will trigger the fire suppressant system. It'll dump nitrogen into the vents. It won't kill them, but they won't be able to breathe well enough to aim a gun." Winnie nodded once. She dropped her camera bag and scrambled toward the kitchen. As she crawled into the narrow, dark space behind the pantry, the sounds of gunfire began to erupt from the main hallway. Pop, 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 the rhythmic sound of death knocking on the door. Winnie's hands were shaking as she found the panel. It was a maze of wires and old switches. "Lee, there are 3 red levers. Which one?" "The one marked System Alpha." Lee's voice came through the open door, calm despite the crashing sound of the foyer doors being kicked in. "Do it now, Winnie, and stay down, no matter what you hear. Do not come out until I call your name." Winnie pulled the lever. A massive hiss erupted through the walls like a giant serpent exhaling. Below her, she heard coughing, muffled shouts, and then the heavy thud of Lee's cane hitting the marble floor. She stayed in the dark, breathing in the scent of dust and old copper. She heard voices, Morty's voice. "Where is she, Kang? Where's the little brat? Give her to me, and maybe I'll let you die with your dignity." "She isn't here, Morty." Lee's voice was like ice. "She's already gone. You're chasing a ghost, and you've walked right into a graveyard." A shot rang out. Winnie bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She didn't scream. She waited, because she was a Kang, and a Kang doesn't break. The aftermath was a blur of blue lights and hushed conversations. The penthouse was a wreck, glass everywhere, the smell of cordite thick in the air. Morty was gone, hauled away in a body bag after a failed home invasion that the police would conveniently overlook once the right envelopes were delivered. Lee Kang sat on the edge of the sofa. His shirt was torn, and a bandage was wrapped around his upper arm where a graze had turned the white fabric crimson. He looked older. The fire in his eyes had dimmed to a smolder. Winnie stood by the window. She was holding her camera again. She had taken a photo of the wreckage. A photo of the silver bird on Lee's cane, lying in a pool of shadow. "The car is ready, Winnie," Lee said. His voice was thin. "The feds are going to use this. They'll say I put a child in danger, and they'll be right. I've made arrangements with a school in Switzerland. You'll be safe. You'll have your mother's money. You'll never have to see a gun again." Winnie turned around. She looked at the man who had the city in his palm, but couldn't seem to hold onto a single person. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "It's what's best for you." "I didn't ask what was best." Winnie walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in the hollow room. "I asked if you wanted me to go." Lee looked away. He looked at the city lights, the kingdom he had built out of bones. "I am a monster, Winnie. You saw it tonight. I don't know how to be a father. I only know how to be a protector. And I'm not even very good at that." "You're wrong," Winnie said. She sat down next to him. She didn't hug him, they weren't there yet, but she leaned her shoulder against his. "You think being a father is about being perfect, but my mom wasn't perfect. She was just there. You were there tonight. You stood in front of that door so I didn't have to." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small memory card from her camera. She placed it in his hand. "On that card are the photos I took this month," she said. "Photos of you reading those war books. Photos of you looking out the window when you thought I wasn't watching. Photos of the way you look when you're worried about the city. You aren't a monster, Lee. You're just a man who forgot he was allowed to have a home." Lee closed his hand over the card. He felt the sharp edges of the plastic biting into his palm. "If you stay," Lee whispered, "the feds will never stop. The rivals will keep coming. You'll be a target for the rest of your life." Winnie looked him in the eye, the Afro-Korean girl and the Mafia boss, two halves of a broken mirror. "Then we'd better start building a bigger wall," she said, "because I'm not going to Switzerland. I'm staying right here, in the middle of the fire, with you." Lee Kang let out a breath, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to release 10 years of tension. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. "Then we have work to do, daughter." 1 year later. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that only happens when the most powerful people in the state are waiting for a single word. Lee Kang stood at the front of the room. He wasn't wearing his charcoal overcoat. He was in a tailored navy suit. He looked like a statesman, a philanthropist, a father. Beside him stood Winnie. She had grown an inch. Her hair was braided neatly, and she wore a locket that contained a photo of her mother and a photo of the Blue Line train where it all began. The judge, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, looked down at the documents on his desk. "Mr. Kang, the social worker reports are exemplary. The educational tutors, the psychological evaluations. It seems you've provided a life for this young lady that most would envy." Lee didn't look at the judge. He looked at Winnie. "I didn't provide it, Your Honor. We built it, together." "And Winnie," the judge asked, "is it your wish to legally become a member of the Kang family, to take the name, to remain in this guardianship permanently?" Winnie stepped forward. She didn't look at the reporters in the back. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked at Lee. "A year ago, I made a deal." Winnie's voice was clear, resonant. It filled the courtroom. "I thought I was buying a shield. I thought I was hearing a man to stand in a chair and look like a dad, but you can't buy what we have. You can't contract the way someone looks at you when you're scared, or the way they teach you to find your own strength. My name is Winnie Kang, and I'm already home." The judge smiled, a rare, genuine thing, and brought the gavel down. Crack. As they walked out of the courthouse, the sun was shining off the Chicago skyline. It was a new day. A different kind of power was rising. Lee Kang didn't have the city in his palm anymore. He had something much smaller and much more important. He held Winnie's hand as they walked down the steps. "So," Lee said, a hint of wit in his voice, "now that it's official, what's the first order of business, partner?" Winnie pulled her camera from her bag and aimed it at the skyline. She framed the sun, the tall buildings, and the man standing beside her. "The first order of business," she smirked. "I think it's time we bought that shipping company Morty used to own. I have some ideas for the gallery, and I think the Kang name could use a little more color. Lee laughed, a real deep sound that startled the pigeons on the sidewalk. They walked into the crowd, two people who had started as a strategy and ended as a soul. The city was still cold. It was still dangerous, but for the first time, neither of them was walking through it alone. They were a family, by choice, by blood, and by the unbreakable contract of the heart. Do you love this story? I believe you did. Now, click on the subscribe button to subscribe and also drop in the comments your current city.